Last Sunday evening on television, the 60 Minutes program carried a segment on the refugee camp Al-Za'atari. It's in northern Jordan. It is the largest camp in the world. There are 70,000 people trying to survive there, and 50% of them are children. The people lack food, potable water, and medical care. This is not an easy place to live in, and it is unlikely that they will ever be able to return to their homeland in Syria, which has been devastated by warring factions. This is a very difficult place to live. Like the Syrian refugees, the Israelites lost everything they had while they were held in Babylonian captivity, the story we heard in the first reading. But Isaiah said to them, "Better days are ahead." Don't we wish for better days ahead? Isaiah said to them, "You will have all the water, all the wine, all the milk, all the food you want, and don't worry if you have no money." God has a stimulus package for you, and it will provide not only for your physical needs, but also your spiritual needs. We know that part of our baptismal covenant with God is to be partners with God in bringing about a peaceful kingdom here on earth. And that's a difficult thing to do, but our efforts to work for reconciliation and justice here on earth is fed by and grounded in our anticipation of an eternal paradise. We believe in that everlasting life after death. And that's what drives us to do good things here on earth. It's something we look forward to, this eternal place, even though no date or time has been set yet. So in the meantime, full of hope, you and I move along with our lives, whatever it is that we do, wherever we live, whomever we live with. We move along with our lives trying to respond to a number of things: the global pandemic, protests in our cities, the Black Lives Matters movement, an unpredictable job market, and uncertain school openings. These pressing issues make it more difficult for you and for me to keep our part of the bargain, our part of the covenant with God, to help deliver other people from what is really looking like a modern-day exile. Even when you and I are preoccupied with our own expectations, our own needs, there is still this urgency to release others, strangers, from harm. This is a difficult task, but that's what we Christians are called to do. Whenever people in our country and other nations are in financial trouble and do not feel secure or safe, government leaders are expected to act. The same is true here in our country. We expect our elected officials to take care of us in some way. Not that we deserve it, but it's part of the covenant. It's part of the deal. It's part of their job. Since the pandemic, more than 40 million people in this country have applied for unemployment benefits. And we can only hope that Congress will pass a second stimulus package, hopefully very soon, before they take a summer vacation, that makes sense for the average person like you and me, and not just big businesses and corporate monopolies. Although there is hope for an effective vaccine, no one really knows how long will it be before our nation and other countries will be liberated from the COVID-19 captivity. How much more financial help will be needed to help us survive? Who will provide that money? Will it be religious organizations like our Catholic Church that will have to step up our efforts even more to help other people out? The popular gospel that we heard proclaimed today about the feeding of the multitudes, the multiplication of the fish and the loaves, is mentioned 6 times in the Bible. For a greater understanding of this text, the narrative that comes before it is significant. It describes the horrific beheading of Jesus' cousin John the Baptist by Herod Antipas, a terrible leader. Mary McGloin, a member of the leadership team of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet, and that's a community that serves us so well here in our diocese, wrote that Jesus was really upset and depressed over the murder of John. And so Jesus needed to get away to ponder the incident, to pray and refresh his own well-being. Sometimes we have to get away to refresh our own well-being. However, Jesus could not escape the crowds that followed him along everywhere, nor could he ignore those in the crowd who were sick and who were without food. So unselfishly, Jesus put aside his grieving for John in order to comfort for the people who were physically and spiritually in need. Jesus was an excellent counterpoint to the egomaniac Herod, who only thought of himself and who did terrible deeds to the people who were entrusted to him. According to McGloin, perhaps Jesus thought that the best way to remember and honor the work of John the Baptist was to put more energy into his own ministry, tending to the people in need. So the good question is, who will pick up where Jesus left off? This past week, we observed the gracious ways in which many political and religious leaders, historians, writers, and musicians remembered civil rights leader John Lewis. Throughout his life, with unbreakable endurance, he stood boldly and humbly for equality and for voting rights for people of color and all peoples. We cannot forget that the other virus that we are dealing with in this country is racism. Who will pick up where John Lewis left off? On the vast field near Lake Galilee, Jesus blessed and broke the bread. He gave it to his disciples to distribute to the large crowd. These words of his remind us of what he said during the Last Supper. After blessing and sharing the bread and wine, he said to his followers, "Do this in memory of me." Now, Jesus was not instructing the disciples on how to celebrate the liturgy. He was asking his followers to clothe the naked, to visit the sick, to bury the dead, to visit those in prisons, and to feed those who are hungry, the very things that he did throughout his entire life. Scripture scholar John Pilch wrote that the real miracle of the feeding of the multitudes, the multiplication of the fish and the loaves, is this. It's amazing that by his example, Jesus urged the crowd to do what? To share with one another their own meager goods. This gospel story and the daily breaking of the bread by early Christians in the history of our church in their homes is helpful to you and to me today. No matter where you are, if you are feeling like there's very little that you can do because of illness or old age, there is always something for us to do in our lives to help promote the goodwill of all peoples. So if you're watching this from wherever you are, you can continue to pray. You can maybe pick up the telephone if you can to call someone you haven't spoken to in a long time. And maybe with the help of someone else, you could sit down and write a letter to a long-lost friend. There are so many things that you and I can do today to keep the gospel stories alive in our hearts, not to be overwhelmed by all the things that are bothering us today. Our service to sick and starving people in our communities is once again driven by a desire for you and for me to hasten the spiritual banquet that Jesus gave us at a table where no one will be hungry, where there is no oppression by a dominant dictatorial regime, where there is no prejudice, where there is no virus. That's our task. And like Paul declared in today's second reading, there is no cosmic power anywhere that can separate you and me, anyone, from the love of God.